Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope that you had a good weekend and that you're feeling ready to get back into it. We are dealing with legislatures still, and it's such an interesting time to talk about legislatures because they really play an important role in limiting some of the powers of these increasingly authoritarian populist leaders in many countries in the world. Now, they can also become accelerants to that concentration of power, like in some cases, like Hungary, where the legislature becomes a rubber stamp for the executive. But where the legislature remains an opposition, and where the legislature remains a viable democratic institution, it remains incredibly important. And we need not look any further than a place like Venezuela, where, to the extent that opposition is still allowed to exist, it exists in the legislature. Now, when we talk about the legislature, as you know, the powers that they have can vary considerably, and no two legislatures are the same. This is one of those things about institutions that's often difficult to comprehend. The idea that they have similarities, but they're all sort of different because of how unique legislatures can be on an individual basis. Those powers are really important because how much they can actually do depends on those powers and to what extent they can actually check the executive or limit the power of the executive depends on those powers. And so, what we'll do today and what we'll do to set us up for what we'll do for the rest of the week is begin to identify some of those powers. Some of this will relate to the functions that we've already discussed, but these powers get more to the actual distribution of political power between, say, the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. And so pay close attention to the kinds of issues that arise. We'll watch some video footage at some point, but I'm also going to present to you a list of different variables that relate to different dimensions of legislative power. And these will be ways that will frame the rest of our discussion this week when we start to address Latin America. Now, let me check on the chat because there's already some activity. Hey, everybody, it's so great to see you. So great to see all of you. Welcome back. Always enjoy coming and discussing the institutions of democracy. So, we've got legislatures that vary widely in the amount of political power that they actually wield, that they actually can use and do stuff with in society. And this differentiates them from the judiciary, the military, the executive. It's true that executives, militaries, and judiciaries have varying powers and varying capacities and mechanisms in countries of the world, but there's more variation in legislatures. And this is especially important because the legislature is the single most important representative institution in democratic politics. And so the extensive variation from country to country means that some legislatures may be more or less able than others to, to uphold or promote democracy. And then it becomes relevant and important for us to distinguish between them and start to think about some of the different dimensions of power and some of the different aspects or elements of power when we talk about a democratic legislature. The first thing that we'll do to address this question of the powers of democratic legislatures is distinguish between two types. And this is possibly the simplest way that we can begin to address this larger question of the powers of the legislature and how they might differ based upon the type of legislature. The first type is a parliamentary type or a semi-presidential system of government. We'll discuss this in more detail. And the second type is a presidential system of government. And both of these, as you'll see, implies a very different form and function for the legislature in a democracy. And those differences become really meaningful and important when it comes to the formal distribution of political power and what they can actually do under different circumstances. And so parliamentary and semi-presidential systems, these systems have executives that serve the legislature. Now, what does that mean? Well, in a parliamentary system, you vote directly for a legislator or multiple legislators, depending upon the electoral system. And after the legislative election, the legislative majority that emerges as a result of that election then chooses a prime minister. And that prime minister is basically subject to the legislature's confidence. The legislature can remove the executive with a vote of no confidence. It's not like this everywhere, and there are some changes and some little variations here and there, but generally speaking, in parliamentary and semi-presidential systems, the executive serves the legislature. And so the legislature has more power over the executive, frankly, than the executive has over the legislature. Now, sometimes the executive might have its own powers that can sometimes create dual sovereignties, as we sometimes refer to it. But generally speaking, in a parliamentary system, the legislature is really the gatekeeper, sort of the king, right? They're sort of the kingmaker in the sense that they control or really determine the fate of the executive should they choose to. In a presidential system, by contrast, the legislature is independent and it's a co-equal branch of government. So when you go to the polls, you vote for your legislature, your legislator, or your legislators, depending upon the electoral system, but you also vote for the president and you vote for them independently, and their election is not at all related. They survive independently, and the legislature, moreover, is an independent and co-equal branch of government. So it's not, it's not the case that the executive is subservient to the legislature ultimately. Instead, the legislature and the executive are actually sort of subject to each other, theoretically. There's a check and balance system and a separation of powers set up to establish in that. It's very different than a parliamentary system where the executive ultimately serves the legislature. Now, what that means then is in a presidential system, the legislature has less power than it does in a parliamentary system. If it doesn't have the power to remove the executive, it has less power than it would if it had that power. And so when we compare these institutions, that simple difference emerges. This is probably the single most important difference in the political powers of democratic legislatures because it has everything to do with the making and breaking of governments. Now, of course, you would point out that in a presidential system, the legislature can vote to impeach. But it's often the case that higher majorities are required to impeach. And moreover, because it's not as sort of regularized, it's often more difficult to get across the finish line if you're trying to vote to impeach a president. Now, tell that to the Peruvian Congress or the Assembly, where they've impeached like all of the last 5 or 6 presidents in a row, basically because of an institutional rivalry that simply exists between between the executive and the legislature. But generally speaking, parliamentary systems give more direct power to the legislature for this simple reason: they produce the government. Presidential systems, to extend the comment, the powers are separated from the judiciary and the executive, and those three branches are understood as separate and equal, and as check and balance institutions, as we would say in the US. Let me take a look at the chat because we've got some comments here. Christopher says, is it because there is no equal branch in parliamentary? Oh, okay, I answered it. Cool. So this is actually a map that is depicting the different regime types. Now, I really want you to focus mainly on just 3 colors. Focus on blue, which is a presidential system where there's independent survival, independent election of the legislature and the president. And then red is a constitutional parliamentary system. So a sort of ceremonial monarch, but a set of democratic institutions that includes a parliament and that anoints the prime minister. So that includes Canada and much of Europe. But a parliamentary republic with a ceremonial presidency is a system where the ministry is also subject to parliamentary confidence. So there are some variations, but as you can see, in the Americas, we've got presidential systems and independent legislatures. In Canada and in Europe, we primarily have parliamentary systems where parliaments have more power to remove or appoint or adjourn or decide or anoint the cabinet or the government, basically. There's a lot more variation in Africa, and there's a lot of variation in Central Europe and in East Asia as well. But much of many of the countries in these regions are not democratic. This is politics in the context of a one-party state or a ruling presidency. We're mainly interested in democracies, as you know. So we'll focus a lot on Latin America. We'll focus on the Americas. We'll focus on Europe. We'll focus a little bit on some of the African countries, as you've seen already. But generally speaking, we're mainly interested in those places where the institutions of democracy are quite robust, or enough so that we can study democracy and not authoritarianism. Jeffrey says, does it also depend on the process? Yeah, it does. Different countries have different institutions. We can think of them as parliamentary or presidential, but every system, frankly, is a little bit different. They all have rules that are a little bit different. Yeah, Haley, I can go to the last slide. But in just a moment, let me get through these other questions. Actually, hold on. Justin says, would you consider the UK to be a bit of a constitutional monarchy? Because don't the monarchies still have some say in the policy making of the parliament? Well, sure, they can advise and consult, but it's not, they don't have a veto. They don't have a stake or a mechanism for actually controlling the policy process. It's a ceremonial one. It's not a constitutional monarchy. A constitutional monarchy would be like Oman or like Saudi Arabia, where it's like an authoritarian regime. Constitutional monarchies are authoritarian regimes. That's a full-blown authoritarian regime because it's a family that controls the state. In the UK, it's a parliamentary democracy with a ceremonial monarchy or monarch who does effectively have the power to advise, but no democratically elected actor or anointed actor is required to take their input. Justin says, would you, I read that. Jeffrey says, the process of the presidential system to impeach and remove the president, does it depend on how each democracy established it? How can it be more complicated to be removed? Yeah, it does. So some countries have a higher threshold for removal, a higher supermajority that must be crossed. Some countries, it's simple majority. Some countries you need 60% or 4/7 or something like that. Every country is a little bit different. Some countries don't give the legislature the power to remove the president. So not everyone has that power. Why is Russia yellow when it's usually considered as an autocracy? So Christopher says theocracy is monarch. So Saudi Arabia is not a theocracy. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. Iran is a theocracy. A theocracy is a system of government and law that takes divine guidance or that incorporates a scriptural basis. That exists in only a few places in the world, and you might say the Vatican City, and you would say certainly Iran, but theocracies are not. Well, a monarchy can also be theocratic if it has a scriptural basis, but there is a difference between them. And in terms of the yellow, hold on, what does the yellow mean again? Semi-presidential republic. Head of state has some executive powers. So listen, yeah, it's not to say that Russia is a democracy. A semi-presidential republic can be an authoritarian regime. The actual informal politics of a place is what ultimately determines whether or not it's a democratic or an undemocratic context. China refers to itself as a People's Democratic Republic, but it's a one-party state. In Russia, technically, there is remaining executive power is vested in the ministry that is subject to parliamentary confidence. So in Russia, technically, the parliament gives its confidence to approve the ministry, but that's taking place in the context of a competitive authoritarian regime where there's an unlevel playing field, and the incumbent government does abuse its power. And so keep in mind that this is not actually telling us these are not all democracies, right? Some of them are democratic and some of them are not. How democratic it is has to do with whether it meets the criteria that we've used to define democracy, right? So some of these labels by themselves don't really say anything about whether it's a democracy or not. And so notice, for instance, that many countries in Central Africa are also presidential, just like Latin American countries, but most of these places are not democracies. They're, if anything, they're ruling presidencies where a single person, rules with an iron fist and has been in power for maybe a couple decades or something. And so that's a separate question, right? How democratic the system is. Institutions of any kind can be run democratically or autocratically. It has more to do with other things. All right, so let's take a look at an example of a parliament running a vote of confidence or running a no confidence vote. When the parliament votes, the outcome is not necessarily predetermined. It still is a political process, right? And we might assume that a vote will only take place if the outcome is known, or if they know that they'll get the outcome that they want, but we might not know what outcome they want. And so what I'm going to show you now is a video about a recent event in Canada where there was a vote of no confidence that Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister, survived. His party helped to veto that vote of no confidence or reject that vote of no confidence, and they did so with the help of another political party. So this is a relatively long piece. It's 4 or 5 minutes, but there's a lot of really good political analysis in here, especially as it relates to the decision-making process in the legislature and how the rules in the setup influenced the process. This is a parliamentary system, and so remember that this is a process that only takes place in that context. It cannot take place in a presidential system where the legislature, by definition, doesn't have this power, although they may have impeachment power. But let's watch this video.
Morning tonight, Robin Gill.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Canadians have been spared from a snap federal election, 1 year to the day the Liberals won their second mandate. The Conservatives, despite being backed by the Bloc Québécois, have been defeated on a motion to form a special anti-corruption committee aimed at looking into pandemic spending. Reading between the lines, that includes looking into what connection the Prime Minister and his family had to We Charity, which at one point was going to run the student grant program. The Prime Minister insisted the motion would set the stage for a confidence vote and would force an election nobody wanted. Well, the nays had it, and the Liberal government is staying put. Our chief political correspondent, David Aiken, is in the House of Commons tonight. David, did the NDP save Canadians from a snap election?
Well, indeed they did, Robin, for those who did not want an election, and polls say that was a majority of Canadians. Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, was saying before the vote that, he thought it was absurd that the Prime Minister decided to make a motion that simply would have created a parliamentary committee into a confidence matter. It's simply never been done before. But that said, Singh and the NDP say they still believe that there are other ways to hold the government to account over their actions involving the We Charity, as well as spending related to the pandemic.
We are voting for Canadians. We are voting against an election. We are going to continue to work for people. And that means continuing to hold the government to account.
Now, the Conservatives also thought that the PM had vastly overreached, declaring their motion to be a matter of confidence. Nonetheless, the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois, as you mentioned, they voted in favor. They were on the losing side. Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole, though, had this warning for the Prime Minister.
We're here to ask questions in accordance with our role as an opposition party. And we are never going to let the arrogance or entitlement of the Liberal Party to stand in our way of asking reasonable questions that Canadians want us to ask.
Now, what was Trudeau's problem? Well, he tried to argue that had this committee been created by the Conservatives, that would have paralyzed Parliament.
We don't want an election. Canadians don't want an election, but Canadians need to know that their Parliament continues to work constructively.
Now let's talk about the We controversy. Does that go away now?
No, it does not go away, but the investigation into the We Charity and the liberal actions gets folded, I think, into the broader considerations of other government pandemic spending. And that would include what the opposition is calling the latest scandal. And that scandal involves the awarding of a contract for ventilators, a contract worth $270 million to a Montreal company that was just recently incorporated, and one of its principals just happens to be someone who a year ago was in the Liberal caucus. Robin?
David Aiken in Ottawa. Thanks, David. Let's bring in our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stephenson. Mercedes, did the Liberals actually want this election to happen?
That's a great question, Robin. Was it pandemic hardball to avoid scrutiny, or were the Liberals willing to go to an election? Well, certainly the opposition believes the Liberals wanted an election, even though we have heard Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and others deny it. At the end of the day, only the Liberals know what their true intention was here, but I can tell you that sources we've spoken to say that this aggressive and brash statement of actually taking this to a confidence vote meant the threat was real, that the government felt they were not bluffing on this and they were willing to go to the polls if they needed to. One senior Liberal source told me the Liberals felt they could do quite well on an election platform of pandemic spending, childcare, and pharmacare if they did have to face Canadians.
The Liberals seemed rather confident about turning this non-confidence vote their way. Haven't they essentially backed the opposition into a corner?
Well, what mattered here was less whether the Liberals wanted an election and more the fact that they knew the opposition did not. And that's where you're getting at when you talk about backing them into a corner. Erin O'Toole, relative unknown still, and the Conservatives don't have their platform ready. The NDP have no money and run the risk of winning fewer seats. And the NDP had already publicly said as well, Robin, that they didn't think it was responsible to have an election during a pandemic. The opposition knew that Canadians would likely blame them if the government fell, even though it was the Liberals who triggered a confidence vote here. And in that case, it was something they were very wary of.
Even so, this puts the country into perpetual election threat mode. Let's remind Canadians that exactly a year ago, they voted in a minority government.
I remember where I was a year ago very well. The question here is whether the Liberals are going to keep using this strategy when they are exposed to scrutiny or to questions that they don't like. Will the government try to bully the opposition like this by threatening an election instead of opening up their books and being transparent? These confidence votes have come in a very short period of time, and it's a strategy that could become unwelcome for the Liberals if they keep going down this path.
As always, good talking to you, Mercedes.
So there you have it. In a parliamentary system, votes of confidence become an important mechanism for holding the government accountable. And you saw a variety of different elements from our discussion in this video. You saw other accountability mechanisms regarding the expenditure of funds appropriated by the parliament. You see considerations of oversight. You see questions about the behavior and the transparency of the executive. You see issues relating to the power of the parliament to possibly hold the government accountable. Do they have the votes? Do they not? This is politics, it's institutions, it's a mishmash of all these things that we've discussed. And so you see then that in real life, the events that we deal with, the legislature also deals with. And so the context of this, of course, is the pandemic and the way that Canada has responded to the crisis and how the politics of the pandemic in Canada have played out. Now, in this discussion, we've been focusing a lot on the capacity of the legislature to remove the executive, but really that's only one type of power or one capacity or one power of a democratic legislature. And frankly, they might not always have that power in practice. When we talk about power, we really are thinking about four dimensions or four different domains or areas or types of power wielded by democratic legislatures. And so we'll deal with each of these one by one in turn. And what I hope for is that as I identify these and talk about these, that you will comment or ask a question or say something in the chat about your support or opposition for this type of power for a democratic legislature. And if you feel compelled, I would invite you to share your input, because the question that always comes back to us in this class is, given our understanding and our definition of democracy, what institutions should we choose, and what type of Congress or legislature should we design? What powers should we give our elected officials? These are possibly the most important questions of all when it comes to representative government and politics in a democracy. So let's deal with these one by one. First, we'll deal with the powers of democratic legislatures as they pertain to influence over the executive. Second, we'll examine the institutional autonomy of the legislature, or its ability to act independently of other branches of government. We'll talk about the specific or substantive powers that legislatures might have to make decisions in certain kinds of policy areas, or to demand that they be incorporated in any decision-making process related to maybe a declaration of war, or so on and so forth. And then finally, institutional capacity, or the sort of strength or the ability of the institution to exert influence. And so the first dimension pertains to influence over the executive. And the first question that arises is, can the legislature alone impeach the president or replace the prime minister? In the United States, the legislature alone can impeach the president. In Canada, in the UK, the legislature alone can replace the prime minister. In some countries, the legislature alone cannot do that. They must obtain the consent of some other actor. Sometimes it's the judiciary, sometimes it's some other actor. But the question in the issue at stake here is, do we want to give the legislature alone the power to impeach or remove or replace the prime minister? That's a choice that's up to us as institution builders. Secondarily, we ask, do we want the legislators to serve simultaneously as government ministers? Well, that's a relevant question, because the legislature has less influence over the executive, or alternatively, the government might have influence over the legislature. The two might have influence over each other if legislatures serve simultaneously as government ministers. In particular, that might limit the influence over the executive of the legislature, because dual roles for some legislators give the government influence over the legislature, as opposed to the legislature influence over the executive. These are interesting questions that we may not have thought about before, but that pertain directly to power and to questions of influence. Can the legislature summon executive branch officials? Can they bring them to legislative chambers for questioning, or for some sort of subpoena? Can they subpoena them, is the legal term in the context of an investigation conducted by the legislature? Can the legislature investigate the chief executive and its agencies? Does it have the power to do that, or does it not? Some countries, the legislature can certainly investigate the chief executive. The United States is one example. But in many countries, and often in dictatorships, the legislature is denied that power, or they do not have that power. If the legislature cannot investigate the chief executive and its agencies, that diminishes the influence over the executive of the legislature, because that gives the executive more autonomy and more freedom, and it frees them from legislative influence. Does the legislature have effective powers of oversight over the military, law enforcement, intelligence services, secret police? Do the instruments of coercion of the state answer to legislative control? Or are those instruments of coercion free to do as they please? In a country like Chile, for example, the military is almost totally free from legislative oversight with regard to procurement, with regard to lines of authority and decision-making in the defense industry, with regard to intelligence services within the military, you name it, everything. The legislature has essentially no control or power of oversight over the military. In the United States, by contrast, the US Congress has a robust civilian control over the military through powers of oversight in committees and defense committees set up to shore up the civilian upper hand in the relationship with the military, and specifically the legislative upper hand. Most developing countries, by contrast, don't have strong powers of oversight for the legislature. Chile is just one example. Does the legislature appoint the prime minister? In addition to replacing them or impeaching them, do they appoint them? Of course, impeachment relates to a president, but with regard to a parliamentary system, the question is, does the legislature appoint the prime minister or not? And of course, in most parliamentary systems, they do. And that gives the legislature an important modicum of influence and really relegates the prime minister to the legislature. Is the legislature's approval required to confirm the appointment of individual ministers? Does the legislature itself appoint ministers? This is another important source of accountability and source of leverage for the legislature. Requiring the approval of the legislature, the consent of the legislature to confirm the appointment of your ministers can often be a moderating influence on appointment powers exercised by executives. And if the legislature itself appoints ministers, it's even better, because then the composition of the government won't even necessarily resemble the choice made by the executive. It will be purely a function of the legislature's decision making. Now, these are very important powers that are substantial and give the legislature an inordinate degree of influence over the executive. If the legislature had all of these powers, it would be a very, very powerful legislature indeed. But if the legislature had few of these powers, or few of them, it would be a stronger president or stronger executive and a weaker legislature. And we'll see later this week, you've seen already, no doubt, that in Latin America, the reactive assemblies, the reactive legislatures often have fewer of these powers and less influence over the executive. And that's often precisely why we think of them as reactive, because of their limited capacity or their limited influence, their limited ability to control the executive. The second dimension is institutional autonomy. And this relates to the military, excuse me, not the military, I almost said the military. I study the military, and so I often am saying that. But the legislature, this relates to whether or not the legislature exists by itself. Some countries lack a presidency altogether. If there is a presidency, sometimes the president is elected by the legislature. And this is unusual because we often think of parliamentary systems as more in line with this model, and that is truly the case. But in some countries, the president is actually elected by the legislature. And though uncommon, this gives the legislature considerable autonomy to independently choose who the executive will be, and maybe even make a decision that might not be completely in line with electoral results. Is the legislature immune from dissolution by the executive? In some countries like Peru, there is a power on the books that permits the executive to dissolve the Congress under some circumstances. It has to do with the behavior of the Congress and their legislative productivity or lack thereof. And there's great controversy surrounding the use of that power. But immunity from dissolution would be a considerable difference from that model. And it would mean then that the legislature is institutionally independent of the executive, whereas an executive who can dissolve the legislature is clearly independent of the legislature. It's the reverse situation. In Peru, as I've mentioned before, well, it's a mess, I got to be honest, because multiple executives have dissolved legislatures and many legislatures have impeached presidents. So it's a big family fight over there. And it's partly driven by party system fragmentation, which we'll talk about later. But the next question for us is, does the executive lack decree power? Now, you're noticing that many of these relate to powers of the executive. Well, the reason is because the executive and the legislature are always locked in an institutional power relationship, and between them, power can be distributed in a variety of ways. If the executive has no power to decree executive legislation, or that is to make law without the participation of the legislature, that weakens the legislature considerably, and that subtracts from its autonomy. Sometimes laws passed by the legislature are veto-proof, meaning no actor, be it the president, prime minister, judiciary, military, whatever, nobody can veto it. It's supreme. Legislature is supreme. This is a powerful legislature indeed, one that can make veto-proof laws. It weakens the executive considerably, because then the executive can't exercise a check and can't referee, so to speak, or balance the legislature in the way that we envision in a check and balance system with a typical separation of powers. A legislature who has veto-proof supremacy is a powerful legislature indeed. The question, are the legislature's laws supreme and immune from judicial review, is a similar question, and this relates to the legislature's relationship with the judiciary and the Supreme Court. And if the judiciary or the court cannot review the legislature's laws, that substantially empowers the legislature. It weakens the judiciary. Of course, there's also the reverse, where the judiciary not only can review the legislature's laws, but may even be given power to override or make decisions that would ordinarily be made by the legislature, which is actually an event or a pattern that's observable right now in Venezuela, where there was basically an effort by the dictatorship to give the Supreme Court new powers, and the Supreme Court in turn sought to seize the power held by the legislature and weaken the legislature so as to minimize and rebut and counteract the opposition to the dictatorship, which controls the executive, of course. So this question of the balance of power between the legislature and the judicial branch is also relevant, because it has to do with the autonomy of the legislature vis-a-vis an institution apart from the executive. The question, can the legislature initiate bills in all policy jurisdictions? This basically relates to whether or not the executive has gatekeeping power. That is to say, whether the executive can sort of sequester certain policy areas as entirely the domain of the executive, and maybe executive action or decisions made by the executive, or at a bare minimum, the domain of policies or legislation introduced by the executive and only approved or rejected by the legislature. If the legislature, however, can initiate bills in all jurisdictions, it's much more powerful and more autonomous. The question of, must funds appropriated by the legislature be spent, is relevant too. You might remember that during the Trump administration here in the United States, there was a lot of money appropriated by Congress for a variety of different purposes, and in many cases, not all of that money was used. It was just left, and it was unspent despite being appropriated by the Congress. This is an example of a system where the legislature does not have the power to force the spending of money which it has appropriated legislatively. Of course, in some countries, the legislature does have that power, and the Trump administration, would not have gotten away with that if it had been under those rules, as opposed to under the rules of the United States, and so on. Take a look here at the chat. Well, in some countries, the legislature can appoint justices to the Supreme Court, and it just varies. Every system is different. In our system, we're familiar with presidents doing it, and they do so with Senate approval, but it need not always be that way. Sometimes maybe you can imagine a system where the legislature would have that power. But here's the thing, that's up to us, right? We're the institution builders. Suppose we're creating a system. These are choices up to us. And as you can see, there are innumerable choices about how to distribute power between the different branches of a government, and in how we distribute that power will impact how democratic that system is, based upon the criteria that we've set out for defining a democracy. So a few more elements of institutional autonomy. Question, does the legislature control the resources that finance its own internal operation? So does it have control over its financing and its funding? What does that look like? And is it able to exert total control, or must it comply with orders handed down from a comptroller or the executive or agencies of the executive and so on? Are members of the legislature immune from arrest or criminal prosecution? Sometimes members of the legislature are immune from arrest or prosecution. Should they be? Is that compatible with democracy? Is this an element of institutional autonomy that would promote democracy? It's a good question. It's an issue anyone could take up, and I could imagine a variety of different answers. Are all members of the legislature elected? Does the executive appoint any members of the legislature? Remember that I talked about the example of Hong Kong, where voters don't vote for all of the seats. In fact, a large proportion of the seats in the legislature are appointed by political parties, or by business interests who support pro-China political parties. In Chile, between 1990 and 2006, there were non-elected senators. Some were former presidents, others were military commanders. In some cases, the executive can appoint or appoints members of the legislature on a permanent basis. All of these would erode or minimize the autonomy of the legislature, because it's giving the executive power over the legislature, over its composition, over its design, and over its very members. There also are some substantive powers that relate to a legislature and what it can do. And some of these relate to specific areas. So for instance, can the legislature alone change the Constitution? Does it need the consent of the executive branch? Does it need the consent of the court or a judiciary? Can states in a federal system pursue an interstate compact to change the Constitution? If they can, then the legislature's powers are weakened, because that's the distribution of power beyond the boundaries or the confines of the legislature, and it's a sort of parceling out of that power, and it's at least the sharing of that power. If the legislature alone can change the Constitution, that is that's a very important power indeed, and it gives them a great deal of influence. Is the legislature's approval necessary for the declaration of war? Traditionally, in the United States, it was necessary, and legally, formally, it's supposed to be legislative approval that initiates a declaration of war. But over time, there's been a sort of expansion of the powers of the executive office in the United States, and sort of informally, we're now at this place where the legislature's approval is no longer sought. Most of the wars that we've gone to in the last few decades have not been approved by the legislature, by Congress. And so, in law, is the legislature's approval necessary for the declaration of war? And in practice, is it necessary for the declaration of war? Both the de jure and the de facto matter to the actual power of the legislature. Is the legislature's approval needed to ratify treaties with other countries? Or can the executive do this individually? Does the legislature have the power to grant amnesty? Or is it the executive who grants amnesty? Does the legislature have the power of pardon? Or is it principally the executive who uses or has the power of pardon? Can the legislature review and reject appointments to the judiciary? Does the legislature itself appoint members of the judiciary? These are all specific powers that would bolster or empower or embolden the hand of a legislature. And I know that some of these probably sound very far out and very unusual, but these are all examples of systems and institutions that exist. Is the chairman of the central bank appointed by the legislature, or are they appointed by the executive? If they're appointed by the executive, is the executive appointed by the legislature, and so on and so on? Does the legislature have a substantial voice in the operation of the state-owned media? You can see then that there's a lot at stake here. And when we talk about a legislature, we're talking about a multitude of different dimensions of power, dimensions of the capacity to bring about outcomes that otherwise would not have been brought about. Various powers used to address issues of concern to society and to hold the government accountable on the basis of. Various powers that relate to the ability of the legislature to act independently and to be a force on its own and to escape the grip of the court or the executive and so on. Finally, we have institutional capacity. And let me check the time. We're almost out of time. And let me just get through this slide. And I think that that's what we'll try to accomplish. When we talk about institutional capacity, we're talking about the ability of the legislature to accomplish its own goals or to do the stuff that it's tasked with doing. And so this relates to, is the legislature regularly in session? Is it meeting on a frequent basis? Is it building internal expertise? Does each legislator have a personal secretary? Do legislators have at least one staffer with policy expertise? Are legislators eligible for re-election without any restriction? Are legislators interested in and do they seek re-election? Is re-election common enough that the legislature contains a significant number of highly experienced members? In general, when we talk about capacity, we're talking about expertise, experience. We're talking about the resources necessary to fulfill those functions with which the legislature has been tasked. In Chile, for instance, most legislators don't have a huge number of staffers. In fact, the committees in the legislature itself are relatively small with limited capacity. In Latin America in general, legislatures have a limited institutional capacity. If you've done the reading for this week, you know already that many of those assemblies are relatively reactive. Well, part of that is because they're relatively weak legislatures. And the weakness of those legislatures has a lot to do with the strength of the presidents and the executives, which were often made strong precisely because of party system fragmentation and the diversity within society that seemed to represent the potential for disorder and therefore required the concentration of power in the hands of a single individual. And so where capacity is low, there's just less to go around and fewer resources to get stuff done with. And that's by design. That's by design. These are choices made by countries. Choices are made by power brokers and by those who are powerful enough to make them. They're always, always, always imbued with interests, and they're motivated by decisions made on the basis of interest and self-interest in power relations. And so these choices that countries make are not made in a vacuum, and they do have consequences. So we're out of time, everybody. We're going to finish this discussion and start exploring Latin America's legislatures on Wednesday and Friday. And what you'll see is that this emphasis on the powers and the capacities of legislatures helps us to understand some of the weaknesses of the legislatures in Latin America. And eventually we'll begin to focus on executives, and we'll see how the context distributes power unevenly often between presidents and legislatures in Latin America, but also sometimes in other countries too. Okay, everybody, thanks for being here, and I hope this was useful for you, and I'll see you next time.